Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Social Responsibility at Work podcast. I am your host, Angela Howard, CEO and founder of Call for Culture. And I am here with Anthony, who is actually one of our 2025 Culture Impact Lab speakers. My words aren't wording today. Anthony, welcome to the podcast. It's so nice to have you.
Thanks for having me. I can feel my heart pounding in my chest, so I'm probably bringing a little bit of nervousness into the space.
It's all good. It's all
Yeah.
good. We're here to give each other grace. And first
Mm.
of all, I'm just happy to be having this conversation with you because I feel like you and I have we've had a few chats up until this
Mhm.
point, and
Mhm.
we started our conversation off like with the big question, how are you doing?
Mhm.
And um we're kind of in this collective experience right now where
Mm.
that question feels inadequate almost. I
Mm.
like almost want to
Mhm.
find an alternative to it, but um one of the things that we've talked quite a bit about is the collective moment we're in, but also the fact that um we are going through a collective experience where mental health
Mhm.
in the workplace has been a swelling topic, but
Mhm.
it is almost now more than ever more important
Mhm.
given the moment we're in. So I am really excited to talk about your work, talk about what this means, especially for the younger generation. I
Mhm.
am a millennial, maybe elder millennial at this
Mhm.
point. So I think we have a generational difference there, even between the two of us.
Mm.
So I'm always looking to figure out how we can see what are the intergenerational trends when it
Mhm.
comes to mental health, but also some of the things that are upcoming. So I know
Mm.
I'm blabbing. Let's get to your intro and then we'll jump
Sure.
into things.
Yeah. So, hello everyone. I'm Anthony, calling in from the beautiful city of Baltimore, and I have been building a mental health nonprofit for the past 5 years called Evolving Minds, and our mission is to create a culture of care, and we focus our mission in the workplace, building healthy work cultures. And we do this really through advancing social connection and community. So I bring a decade of experience building trust and empathy. Um, yeah.
That's amazing. And it's so needed. Uh, and we know mental health generally in this country has been an epidemic.
Hmm.
And one of the things that
Hmm.
I talk quite a bit about is the role that workplaces have
Hmm.
in that epidemic that we're experiencing. So, can you give us a little bit of just framing? So, someone who's listening to this
Yes.
podcast who's like, okay, I know mental health is a challenge. I know workplaces are like generally working on it,
Hmm.
but give us the background as to the why and why now.
Sure. So in 2020, we went through this collective experience that was really traumatic for many people. I don't think we've processed that in the workplace, and we're moving now into a new trauma with the destruction of the civil workforce. The pandemic, in many ways, opened workers' eyes to the reality that workplaces directly impact people's mental health and well-being. And I experienced this firsthand when I was first launching Evolving Minds. I was working in the grocery store, and at the same time that I was working in the grocery store, there's really this wave of culture change taking place in the workplace. The United States Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, released a phenomenal workplace mental health and well-being framework that in 2022, basically acknowledging that we were in a workplace mental health and well-being crisis. Um, in that report, there are many statistics that are eye-opening. One of them being that 84% of workplace conditions workers said had contributed to at least one mental health challenge. And so I was seeing that in the grocery store. I was hearing the stories of my coworkers in the bathroom having panic attacks. I was seeing all the ways in which our work environment had a negative impact on our well-being, but nothing was really being done to truly support us on the ground, even though we were being called essential workers at the time. So I think the framework is that 5 years ago, many leaders weren't thinking about workplace mental health and well-being before the pandemic. The pandemic opened many eyes. We are now in a workplace mental health and well-being crisis. And the future of work is supportive workplaces, I think, for one reason being that, or there's a need for supportive workplaces because, I'm 29 years old. I'm technically a millennial, younger millennial, but also could be considered Gen Z. So it's pretty confusing for me. And
Identity crisis, right?
yes, yes. And our generation is suffering, where we are entering the workforce. We are experiencing depression, anxiety, and stress, and so there's a greater need to support us, but there's a disconnect in how. So that's, I think, where we're at in 2025.
And this feels like pretty important to address. I mean, it feels like a moment to meet. And I think we talk about well-being quite a bit. I personally would love to see it become a public health crisis and like talked about in that way, because
Yes.
to your point, we are seeing the compounding impacts
Mm-hmm.
of that. And it feels like it's only getting worse because
Mm-hmm.
we are, I think in the past where we've had this kind of steady drumbeat of change or
Mm-hmm.
chaos or big events, as a fellow millennial, older millennial, so, going through like 9/11 and all these
Mm-hmm.
other huge events that impacted folks in my generation.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're now seeing for Gen Z, even Gen Alpha,
Mm-hmm.
it's in rapid succession.
Yeah.
And so let me ask you this: what should organizations be doing other than
Mm-hmm.
the Calm app, or
Mm-hmm.
the yoga classes, or
Mm-hmm.
the surface level activities
Yeah.
that often I see when I'm working with organizations and they're really proud to mention they have?
Yeah.
What are the things they should be focused on?
Yeah. For me, it's time, investing in time for people, and oftentimes we don't have any time,
Mm,
and the organization doesn't have any time, and leaders don't have any time. But that time, utilizing that time to build social connection and community, um, the benefits are enormous.
mm,
There are 97 million lonely workers in America. So the majority of the American workforce is considered lonely. And we are pretty disconnected in many ways, virtual and hybrid work environments, which people love the flexibility, and I totally get that. And at the same time, you now have teams and workers who may only see or meet with someone on their team once a month.
mm,
And so when I think about what organizations can do to really, what is the greatest return on your investment, if I put my business hat on, the time that you invest in your people is going to decrease burnout, reduce workplace stress, which will ultimately reduce costs from, preventing churn and turnover, um, and it doesn't take much time.
mm.
It could be 20 minutes a week, and that's actually our model. 20 minutes a week or biweekly can accelerate team cohesion if you're using the right skills.
Mm.
So it's actually, from my experience, a small amount of time for this enormous impact, but we don't have any time, and that's part of the problem.
Yes. Yeah, there's a sustainability element, right?
Mhm.
Which is we've been working at an unsustainable pace.
Yes.
And I think people are breaking. And I think it's people are breaking mainly because there's a mental part of this where, to your point, during the pandemic, our eyes opened up to the abandonment of some of the other parts of
Mm.
our lives, and then we started doing those things and realized like, oh, this is actually how it's supposed to be. This is like what makes a well-rounded human. We need social connection. We need
Mm-hmm.
exercise. We need movement. We need to see sunlight. Just very human basic
Mm-hmm.
needs were not
Yes.
being met. And it's interesting because I talk a lot about the fact that we are at this pivot point, almost like since the Industrial Revolution,
Mm-hmm.
where I think the Industrial Revolution was very focused on like basic needs,
Mm-hmm.
right? Pay, number of hours people are working, and a lot of those things still need to be addressed, right?
Mm-hmm.
We still have some basic, like foundational things that need to be addressed.
Yeah.
But we've kind of moved up Maslow's hierarchy of needs a little bit in
Mm-hmm.
the expectation of actually, I want to get fulfillment from my job.
Right.
I want to feel a sense of safety and belonging, not
Yeah.
just physically, but psychologically.
Mm-hmm.
And so the bar has raised in that way. It should have always been that way,
Mm-hmm.
but the bar has raised in that way that I
Yes.
think people are expecting more and have seen
Yes.
a different way of living, and you can't
Mm-hmm.
really go back from that.
Mm-mm. Yeah, I like how you're saying the bar has been raised. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, it's and I think for, younger workers, and I
Mm-hmm.
kind of want to move in that direction because I think, as
Sure.
millennials, we pave the way. I
Mm-hmm.
always like to say like we paved the way. I don't think we did a perfect job. I remember being in corporate America and
Mm-hmm.
playing the game and overworking and, kind of falling into some of the norms. And COVID was that moment
Yeah.
where I started my business. I took back the reins of what I wanted my life to be. Um, there's a control element, I think, when we talk about the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what you're saying is organizations also have to give up a little bit of control. And that's
Mm.
a huge philosophical shift for like
Yes.
what the employer employee relationship needs to be.
Yes. This is why I love Dr. Vivek Murthy's framework, because it there's 10 human needs on the framework. One of them is autonomy. Um, and I think one of the exciting elements of the work that we do at Evolving Minds is we empower workers with tools to foster positive culture change. It's not the executive director or the
Mm,
CEO or maybe the head of HR, but maybe an entry level worker which can lead a skill. And I can give an example. We were working with a bakery,
mm,
and we part of our model is teaching organizations how to build community. And one of the team members, who was the graphic design artist for that bakery, um, led a skill for the team where he got all of the managers together. And this is a bakery. This is like high intensity
mm,
production. You can't slow down. We got to bake 500 loaves of bread. It's intense. He got all of the leaders together. He sat them down. He said, "Okay, team, we're going to doodle for 15 minutes." And I didn't teach that worker how to facilitate that skill. They utilized their own skill set, like you mentioned, like meaning, deriving meaning from their work. And after the program, I interviewed a number of the team members that participated in the training, and they all talked about that moment. They were like, "Oh my gosh, that was so amazing. We sat down, we doodled together, we didn't talk, and we felt great. We felt connected." And I'm just like, wow. And one of the team members told me how they their husband was feeling really stressed one day,
mm,
and they said, "Hey, I learned this skill at work that one of my coworkers taught me. Here's a pen, here's a piece of paper, go doodle for 15 minutes." And they said that their husband loved it and they were feeling much less stressed after. So providing people with the autonomy to build culture can
mhm.
really just have a lot of unintended but excellent outcomes. But if you tell a CEO to, "Hey team, we're going to doodle for 15 minutes today," there might be a level of resistance
Mhm.
to that.
Yeah, well, there's an element of play too. I think
Mm,
that and play is what I always kind of note or observe is usually when I see teams playing together, there's some element of safety
Mm.
you have to create to actually get them to play. So, I think if you're going into a culture, an organization that is maybe been unsafe for some time or has been that kind of cycle of burnout, I could
Mm.
see how that might take a little bit of time to be like,
Yes.
why are we doing this? Like, what?
Hmm.
Like, there's skeptics just looking at
Yes.
each other. But then when you break through that wall and people like get the permission to be like, oh, I
Mm.
can, I can like regulate my nervous system right now and
Mm.
just take a moment. Um, that turns into, I think, other tactics and ways that people practice
Mm.
um, managing
What are some,
stress at work.
what are some techniques that you found to be helpful for breaking through that wall or those initial skeptics?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think leadership role modeling helps
Mm.
because when people see somebody of influence, maybe it's not a leader, but somebody who is maybe behaving differently, but there seems to be like a genuine, authentic shift
Hmm.
in them, or they're willing to be vulnerable and, kind
Mm.
of say, like, hey, I was kind of skeptical about this too, but I tried
Hmm.
it and I have this story. So I think humanizing each other
Mm.
is a big part of that. And, at the end of the day, we've created this, the workplace has been created as its own culture and construct that isn't very
Hmm.
human, right? I mean,
Hmm. Hmm.
going back to the Industrial Revolution, we're talking about machines, we're talking about assembly lines. We weren't we weren't thinking about humans at that time, and some of those constructs just kind of continued through the
Hmm.
lineage of how we thought about work.
Hmm.
And I think about like the show Severance, right, which I
Hmm.
love, which many
Hmm.
people watch,
Yeah.
and I mean, it's parody, but it's like we kind of created this really sterile container for people that is not
Yes.
very human, that doesn't have elements from an anthropological perspective that even make a lot of sense for humans to
Mm.
work in. So I do think it's getting back down to basics,
Hmm.
humanizing each other, creating
Yeah.
safe spaces, and also the opposite, which is like, don't create harm. I
Mm.
know that sounds really simple, but a lot of organizations and leaders perpetuate a lot of harm, whether that's yelling, whether that's putting people down, whether that's, lack of transparency. All those things create harm to that type of environment to create.
Hmm. Yes. And a lot of it is, like you were saying, kind of modeled, right, from generations before. So it may be an unconscious, like,
Mm-hmm.
way of working.
Yeah. Yeah, it just takes that one person to break the generational chain, right? To say,
Hmm.
why do we do this? So I think that goes back to your point around autonomy.
Hmm.
People want to feel like they're hired for a role and they can come in and master it and become an expert at it. And that also means challenging. If you hire really talented people, they're going to question you. They're going to challenge you. They're going to perhaps do things better, innovate, grow the company. So I think that, psychological safety is always kind of a buzzword that people maybe sometimes weaponize or use in ways
Mm.
they shouldn't. But at the end of the day, I think about psychological safety as like the opposite of a fight or flight response
Yeah.
or a sign of threat. How are we putting people at ease so that they can do their best work and be their best selves?
Mm. Absolutely.
Yeah. So thinking about Gen Z and now Gen
Hmm.
Alpha that is coming into the workplace, what are some unique challenges you think that's showing up when it comes from mental health, well-being,
Mm.
stress management perspective? Are we seeing different issues? Is it the same as Gen X and millennials? What's the difference?
Well, I think part of the difference is just, which is kind of what we've been saying. There's differences in generational norms. Um, for example, we one of the skills in our training is a connection circle.
Mm,
So we sit in a circle, and for 15 or 20 minutes, we connect around a connection question. One of them being, where do you see the goodness in the world?
mm,
So we either use like a stress ball or an imaginary ball. The imaginary ball is a little bit of that playfulness that you were talking about. It's always great when a CEO throws around an imaginary ball. It helps.
Yes.
Um, but I remember leading this connection circle for a team once, and an older generation worker, they had just started in that team, and they were tossed the imaginary ball, and they kind of opened up about this magical moment where their son was at home doing a little arts and craft thing with Amazon boxes, like making miniature, a play fort, and they really went into depth and shared this story. It was their like first week on the job, and I interviewed them after about the impact of building trust like that. And what they said was, well, my generation, you were told to work and that's it. You work, you go home. No home life at work.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, wow, that was kind of like one of those moments where it's like, here I am, a younger generation, inviting a space to see the goodness
Mm.
in the world and each other. And they have this kind of conditioned way of operating that is like, I've never experienced something like this before. This is out there.
Mm-hmm.
But it brought them a lot of meaning. And so when I think the main need for Gen Z and millennials is um, a greater openness in the workplace for mental health, talking about mental health, awareness of mental health, support of mental health. And for older generations, that's going to be really hard because they've kind of been closed up, even though they also experience
Mm-hmm.
mental health challenge. We all have shit that we go through in this life. No
Right.
one, right?
Yes.
We're all struggling with something deep,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes dark, but we
Mm-hmm.
rarely connect about that in the workplace. So,
Yeah, and that's a really great point. And I'll bring up the Severance analogy,
mhm,
which again, it's just I use it all the time because it is a very potent depiction of this like dystopian world
mhm,
where literally you're shutting your brain off from one sphere of your life into the next, and what that signifies in a way, which is, it takes away a bit of the human, severs a bit of the human experience when it comes to
mhm,
work. And thinking about all of the, I think about all of the ways and earlier in my career where I contorted myself or,
mm,
really because I was an older millennial, with older parents, by the way. So my parents are boomers. So I almost felt, even though I was a millennial, I always felt I was at this cusp of Gen X a little bit because I was like going through some of the same
mm,
life experiences as them, and they were like our bigger sisters and brothers.
mhm,
And I remember the amount of waste and the amount of lack
mm,
of potential that I was able to bring because I was just so focused on these imaginary perspectives that
mm,
kind of were like omnipresent. And that's really what culture is, right? And
yeah,
that's why it's so hard to shift, because there are these belief systems, these value systems,
mhm,
these sacred cows, all the words we use for things that exist but nobody can really put their finger on. um
mm,
and I think now mental health is this like big, bold, sort of, for a while, like taboo topic that
mhm,
started entering the workplace. And I think we're seeing a lot of these big topics entering the workplace: politics, social
mhm,
movements, right? Because millennials, Gen Z, Alpha, we all want to work for an organization that cares about people
yes,
and the planet.
yep,
And there's a purpose driven element to the work that we do. And that's an intergenerational shift, I believe.
mhm,
It might be a little bit stronger as we get to younger generations, and the accountability gets higher, but there's something happening, and I'm feeling like this very clear kind of tension
mhm,
between some of these topics. And I think mental health is one of those things that people talk about that they don't want to touch, or they don't want to like actually move forward because it feels
mhm,
too needy. And
mm,
I mean, some people listening to this podcast, maybe older generations, might say, like, why should the workplace
Mm-hmm.
have a hand or a responsibility in somebody's mental health? So what would you say to that?
Well, let me put on my business cap real quick. I'm going to put my business cap on.
For those of you who
Um,
can't see Anthony, he's literally putting on his business cap.
yes. If I speak the business language, the bottom line is really impacted. I give the example of when I worked in the grocery store. So I worked in the grocery store for 2.5 years during the pandemic while I was building Evolving Minds. And there were days where I just felt like shit and my mental health was really impacted. And you could see that on almost every team member's face. Those days when a customer would come up to me, I'd be like, and they'd be like, well, can you help me find this or that? I'd be like, yeah, it's probably in that aisle. Like, and that's it. Kind of brush them off.
Yep.
The days that I was feeling joy or happy, largely a result of me feeling connected with my other team members. A customer might come up to me and say, I'm looking for this. I'm, thinking about cooking this tonight. And I would go, oh, that sounds really good. Have you thought about this ingredient? Oh, let me walk you over here and show you this ingredient too. And have you gotten that ingredient? And all of a sudden the customer, oh, did you know about our case discount? All of a sudden the customer is walking out with a handful of food and maybe they only came in looking for one thing, but because I had connected with them, maybe even they told me their name. I had customers telling me my name. They're going to come back again and they're going to come back again and again and again. And that retention is going to increase profits if we're thinking about profits. So there's the productivity element where those with a mental health challenge are going to be less productive. I don't really like saying that, but it is when you look at the data or, if you're feeling really depressed or anxious or stressed or overwhelmed, it's going to be hard to get out of bed. It's going to be hard to get to the workplace.
Yeah.
Might be less likely to stay at that job. So that's the business element. And of course, I think we're also here to talk about the human element where empathy is so important as a leader. Understanding what people are going through and wanting to support them and help them. It feels good. So there's just the human element where supporting people is the right thing to do. And then there's the business element where it'll definitely advance your mission.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is, the employee experience is directly connected to the customer experience, right? If I'm having a bad day, if, my leader is causing me harm, I'm probably going to repay that in some type of way at my job, with my coworkers, with the customer. And I always think about the social responsibility of organizations. That's why this podcast is called Social Responsibility at Work. But, the question is, are you sending happier, healthier people home to their families, their communities? Right. There's this ripple effect.
Yes.
And I always just observe that there's this huge gap in that realization that as a leader, you're a caretaker. And a lot of times leaders see themselves as, I'm in a position, I have a title, I have authority, I have power.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's like, no, you're not managing work. You're managing you're leading people if you're
Right.
a leader. And it is more of a choice to say, I understand I have these people in my care and I can do things to harm them or, or to help them thrive and not just survive. So you also talked about retention of customers, of employees, reduced turnover, general vibes. I know that's not like a measurement, but like I am so acutely aware when I walk into like a Panera Bread or a restaurant or any establishment, I can sense when the culture is good. Like I can sense it right away. I'm, how the the cashier greets me. Absolutely. Or even like witnessing the interactions and the collaboration in the background, are people like frustrated and yelling at each other, and like you can just tell the
Mm-hmm.
collective culture, and that has an impact. Like I'm not going to go back there if I sense tension, if the vibes are
Yeah.
off. So it's definitely a bottom line item that's really hard to measure. So
Mm.
tell me a little bit more about how you measure the impact of all this.
Yeah, that would require, I think, measuring. So for our programs, when we measure our impact, we look at short and medium term outcomes, longer term outcomes, and kind of aspirational. So in the short term, when you invest in people, earlier we mentioned time, you increase social connection and community, you increase trust, you increase empathy, you increase social support, you increase belonging, you decrease burnout, you decrease workplace stress. Those are immediate things that can be measured with scales and other
Mm-hmm.
tools, surveys, focus groups, one-on-one discussions. I think what is a little bit more challenging and is something that we are looking to kind of get to the next level are those longer term outcomes when it comes to job quality, when it comes to um, reducing turnover, um, lowering healthcare utilization costs. All of these things
Mm.
can be measured. But for a smaller nonprofit like us, we need the funding to be able to work with research partners to be able
Yes.
to show those benefits. And
Mm-hmm.
I think for us, what we're seeing though is that just talking to the people you're impacting, talking to the workers, they will tell you what the impact is. So, when we've sat down with team members, what they say is that this model, it supports, valuing people as whole people, right? We're whole
Mm.
people. And that when you get to that level of like aspirational outcome, and we're seeing that, it is fostered by a culture of connection where people are connected with each other, and that leads to health outcomes as well. um, you're going to get sick less often if your workload pressures are so intense that they're causing you physical and mental stress that might lead you to getting sick more often. You're going to have to take more time off work. You're going to have to utilize more sick days. So there is really an
Mm-hmm.
interconnected nature with this. And I wonder how companies with significant money, if they're looking at these things,
Yes.
but in the nonprofit sector, there has been little to no research done for millions and millions of workers. And
Mm.
that is true across nonprofits and retail. And so there's a gap. We are looking up an empathy scale in the workplace. We can't find an empathy scale in the workplace. So it's 2025 and we've got artificial intelligence, but we have not figured out an empathy scale in the workplace. I'm
Yeah, let's just jump to the machine learning and not
Mhm.
the human growth potential, right? You bring up a great point, which is, I mean, like nonprofit workers and retail workers. I'm trying to think of like the percentage of the workforce that fits into those two categories.
Massive. It's
It's
massive.
huge. It's got to be
Yeah.
more than, is it more than half?
I'd have to look at the data, but it is a monumental number.
Yeah, those are huge sectors that um oftentimes I think nonprofits, social enterprises, especially mission driven organizations, what I find is, you see kind of the external veneer of the work that they're doing. Not
Mhm.
veneer, that's the wrong word, because a lot of times they're doing really, really impactful work, mission
Yeah.
driven work. But the veneer comes in where it's like the internal treatment of their
Mm.
people,
Yes.
and kind of this lack of understanding that if you're not taking care of your internal team,
Yeah.
your opportunity for impact is greatly reduced.
Yes.
And especially if you're hiring people who look like the communities you're serving, right? Or for
Mhm.
marginalized communities or
Mhm.
um, underfunded, underserved communities, um, you're just perpetuating
Yep.
some of the same issues that you're trying to fight against. So nonprofits really, it excites me about the work that we can do there
Mhm.
because there is such a societal,
Yeah.
progressive societal impact that we can make if we could just get that internal culture really
Yes.
solid.
Yeah. Nonprofits workers are amazing. They're incredible. And over 50% of nonprofits are experiencing severe burnout to the point where they can't retain people.
Mm.
You'll find zero funders, zero foundation funders in America funding workplace mental health and well-being for the nonprofit sector. Zero with
Mm.
that priority area. There was one, but they shifted. Um,
Oh.
so you have all of these workers that are on the front lines. They are talking to domestic violence victims. They are talking to teens that are suicidal. They are supporting refugees with trauma. They are engaged in the work, and that takes an even greater toll on their mental health and well-being. But unfortunately, because they've been under-resourced, it is a really I don't want to say existential crisis, but
Mm.
for the nonprofit workforce, you have no one funding solutions. You have no models really that have been scaled or developed or have been research backed. And you have millions of workers that need these support systems. So it is really an I don't want to say tapped, but
Mm-hmm.
undervalued community of need. And a lot of the workplace mental health nonprofits that exist focus on the for-profit sector because that's where they can actually get some revenue to sustain themselves as an organization. Because if they
Yes.
focus on the nonprofit sector, it's going to be hard to generate revenue for pro. Anyway, I'm getting really into the weeds here. I should
No.
probably pause before I go any further. I could talk about nonprofits all day, but again, I want to be careful about how I talk about them because they are amazing. They're doing incredible work, and they are being attacked right now on all sides. Um,
Mm.
their value and their worth are being questioned at the nonprofit level and both the federal worker level. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a really tough balance of like they really need support. Many of them are toxic workplaces, but they're also engaged, doing the work. They're incredible
Yes.
people. They're caring. They're kind. They're empathetic. It's a
Absolutely.
challenge.
It absolutely is. And yeah, when you're talking about funding and you have this population that you are serving, all that goes to that, right? And you're,
Mm-hmm.
you're living in survival mode around that funding and the scrappiness. And, I almost feel like there's an opportunity, and maybe you and your work at
Yes.
Evolving Minds could help with
Yeah.
this, but, kind of reimagining nonprofit model to be a sustainable
Yes.
model, sustainable infrastructure for the people who run it. Um,
Yes.
it's almost like it's set up to fail in some ways. There's some
Yes.
toxicity that just naturally breeds, with
Mm.
the scarcity mindset. I mean, people's
Yes.
brains when they're in a scarcity mindset, it really isn't a good formula
Mm-mm.
for innovating or, mental health and well-being. And so I think we have a real opportunity to say, how do we build sustainable models for
Yes.
nonprofits that include these types of programs or these types of solutions for the
Yeah.
people?
Yeah. That is the question of, I think, 2025. There is some hope in terms of foundation supporting grantee well-being. The Center for Effective
Mm.
Philanthropy released a report, a research snapshot series, um, on the ways in which foundations are supporting grantee
Mm.
well-being. Um, but it is really early stages. It is like, again, this is, as we're talking about timeline here, this is an emerging field. Um, so yes, there's the potential to create and scale culture change in the nonprofit sector is immense.
Yeah.
And I'm hopeful that and also the desire for like nonprofit workers, wanting people first work cultures. There's just such a desire, and so I'm hopeful that over the next decade or so there will be more investment in the people. But again, that's kind of on the chopping block culturally. So
Mhm. Yeah, well, I'm excited because this kind of creates a I mean, I know nonprofit, when you think about nonprofit and economy, the two things don't really mesh together, but
mm,
but it is creating like an economy, a new economy around these things.
mhm.
And so I'm very excited for the work that you're doing. I
Thank
know we're
you.
going to have an incredible time at the Culture Impact Lab with you there. So just
Yeah.
very excited to be with you and to bring your brilliance to the space that
Thanks.
we've created. If people want to reach out to you, so they're interested in learning more about
Sure.
services at Evolving Minds, or keeping up with you all and all the work you're doing, where can they find you?
Yeah, and I'm excited about the Culture Lab too, and I hope everyone who's listening is thinking about attending, or is already attending, and then I'll see you there. Um, you can reach out at my personal email, Anthony at evolving-minds.org, or you can go to our website, evolving-minds.org. Always open to connecting and having a conversation, even if you are like, I actually disagree with you, Anthony, on some of the points you made. I'd be open to hearing your side of the story. So,
Wonderful. Yeah, we have to have these conversations, I
mhm,
think. And there's a collective responsibility for us to get it right and to
mhm.
start to move the work forward in a way that's sustainable um, and sticks. So
Yes.
very grateful for you, Anthony. Thank you
Thank you.
for being with us today.
Well, I'm grateful for you.
Yay!